Okay, welcome everyone to the Vigilant Label presentation. We have Dr. Peter Beck and Jeff Fontaine, the founders of the system. They're going to go over a PowerPoint presentation, and then we're going to discuss the device itself and how to sell it into today's medical market. So Jeff and Peter, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Really do appreciate it. So I'll say good afternoon, and I think good morning to our folks that are still on the West Coast. We really, truly appreciate the time. So this is Jeff Fontaine. I really lead our sales efforts for Vigilant. And with me in the room is Dr. Peter Beck, who is the founder and developer of the technology that we're going to show you. So we're going to spend roughly the next 30 to 40 minutes walking through the PowerPoint presentation. And we've got three main objectives that we'd like to accomplish. So first is we want to discuss the challenges that are happening in the OR today as it relates to labeling. We want to certainly showcase our solution, and then we want to discuss the sales process, particularly in the context of how we've been successful to date, some of those key questions that you will drive with your contacts, and then how we will support you through that sales process as well. So that's what we look to accomplish today. With that, Kevin, can you go to the next slide? So what I'd like to do in terms of a beginning point is to really introduce Peter. I think that there's some key things that we'd like everyone on the phone to take away today. And, the first one is that he's a practicing anesthesiologist. In fact, yesterday, Peter was in the OR multiple times dealing with these situations that we'll talk about. The other thing about Peter that's important for you to understand is that he's been a user of multiple systems. So he's used competitive systems. He's used label tape rolls for years. He really, truly understands all the nuances that surround the workflow, the unique components to the workflow, and he's been able to incorporate all that knowledge into the building of the system that we're going to talk about today. So I think that's a really important fact. I think the next thing I would point out about Peter is that he can be a real resource for you in your sales engagements. What we found when we talk with clients is oftentimes there's nothing better than an anesthesia provider to anesthesia provider conversation, right? Let Peter talk about the challenges. Let him talk about the system. Let him ask questions of the anesthesia provider and really create that dialogue of user to user, of subject matter expert to subject matter expert. So I think that's a key point that I'd love for everyone on the call to take away today is that he is available and he's a resource for you to use in that context. The last thing I want to point out is he's a technologist at heart. I like to give him a difficult time. So when I want to have downtime, I like to play golf. I'll spend time with the wife and the pups. Peter likes to share with me that he likes to go and code. So when he needs time away and he wants to really relax, he finds a lot of benefit in just working with technology and solving problems. So it's that perspective that he's really brought to this business and the solution that we're going to show you. Next slide, Kevin. So I don't want to spend a great deal of time here, but I wanted this to be in the materials that you could access later on. And so there's four key elements I'll quickly go over here, but we'll dig into some of these aspects, at least the most critical aspects that you want to remember, that you want to introduce to your customer in a few slides. But really particularly here, the first thing I want to point out is there's absolutely a patient safety issue in the OR, and a patient safety issue that's directly corollary to labeling. There's a really interesting Washington Post article that we can make available to everyone on the phone that talks specifically about labeling issues in the OR and the impact of those labeling issues from a safety perspective. The second thing to point out is really the inefficient workflow design of the solutions that are available in the market today. So the competitive products that have been developed and sold to some of your clients likely really don't address the core workflow challenges of an anesthesia provider. And they're inefficient, they're complex in use, and so that's one of the things that we sought to solve. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The next piece to point out is we refer to as a gap in technology. So this is particularly related to anesthesia medical records. So what we see is there's oftentimes difficulty in proper documentation of the anesthesia medication record. And we see that across all of the clients, quite frankly, that we've engaged with to date. So we think there's a real opportunity through this solution and through some of the things that are coming from Epic, Cerner, Meditech, and many others that will help solve for this gap in the anesthesia record. And then the last piece is about the mandate, the regulation. You know, certainly that's probably your number one opportunity when you talk with clients, is the lack of compliance for CMS in their October 2015 letter, where they said to all pharmacy directors that they must follow USP 797 as it relates to anesthesia medications. And that's a critically important detail, and we're going to dig into that in just a moment. But I wanted to give you this perspective that these are the problems that anesthesia providers, directors of pharmacy are really facing as it relates to labeling. Thanks, Kevin. So here what we want to talk about is kind of streamline down that discussion and really focus on three core challenges that anesthesia providers, director of pharmacies are facing. And so the first one at the top, I think, is critical. And that's that we want that anesthesia providers want a system that is incredibly simple to use and that augments their workflow, doesn't detract from their workflow, doesn't detract from what they're trying to do for the patient. They need a labeling solution that adds to what they're doing, not takes away. The second component is what I referenced just a moment ago, and that's that compliance piece, right? So as I stated, in October of 2015, CMS produced a letter to all of the pharmacy leaders that said, you know, compounded medications, which equates to anesthesia syringes, are required to be labeled with multiple data elements, right? So the drug, the dosage, the date, the time, the user initials, as well as the beyond use date. And so it's critical that anesthesia providers are following this compliance aspect. And let me just give you a couple of examples, a couple of realities that our clients have seen just in the last 6 months. So we were contacted by a hospital system in Philadelphia, very reputable, very well respected. And just a week prior, they had had Joint Commission come through. And Joint Commission is one of the bodies that is looking for compliance with anesthesia labeling. And they actually passed their Joint Commission audit. Now, there's a potential likelihood that they didn't get into anesthesia syringe labeling during that Joint Commission audit. But what actually happened to that hospital system was a week later, the Pennsylvania Health and Human Services Department came through with their audit. And that actually was an unannounced audit. So let me point out that detail of announced versus unannounced. So oftentimes what happens is Joint Commission in the past has announced that they're coming, right? And Peter and I joke because he's actually a practicing anesthesiologist, one of his hospital systems that he was practicing at sent him an email and said, hey, next week Joint Commission is coming. You know, we would really appreciate it if you would do these 6 things so that we don't get dinged during our audit. And, you know, one of those 6 things was syringe labeling. So that large hospital system in Dallas actually recognize that, our anesthesia providers are not probably following the letter of the law. So let's send out a notice. Let's let them know in advance that Joint Commission is coming. But the Health and Human Services Department of respective states are not required to announce. And that's what happened in this Philadelphia example. So Health and Human Services came through and specifically wrote them up for their syringe labeling issues. And I don't think it was but a couple of days later, Peter, that the client actually reached out to us after doing, I believe, a Google search, or maybe it was through social media, where we were able to address and help them solve their labeling challenges. So compliance is going to continue to be an aspect that hospitals all across the country are going to look to solve for. We had another example just recently in the Dallas-Fort Worth area where a large children's hospital, very similar thing happened. The state Health and Human Services came through and dinged them for their syringe labeling. And we expect this to ramp up over the next couple of years as they get used to auditing for that particular component, that they're following the rules of USP 797. So, Kevin, could we go back a couple of slides? One more, if we could. Perfect. So, actually, next one, Kevin. My apologies. There we go. So I want to point out the cost aspect because I think that's another important element for you to consider. So from a cost perspective, the things that we hear from our clients are really two things. First, they're looking for a solution that isn't burdensome from an IT implementation perspective, doesn't consume a lot of resources for deployment. Of course, resources cost organizations, particularly large, complex organizations like a Providence Health that I was just speaking with Jim about, or a New York Presbyterian. So they're looking for something that's very simple to implement, but that's also at a fair price that addresses their needs, right? So something that addresses compliance, is very simple to use, helps them with documentation, but a system that doesn't burden them from a capital purchase perspective or even an ongoing operational perspective. And so these are the three challenges that we believe we solve best in our space. So Kevin, let's go to the next slide. So here's how we solve these, and really what our messaging is about when the client is asking, well, tell me about Vigilant Labels. There's three core things, again, that I would focus on and that we have focused on in our selling efforts. So first, we're incredibly easy to use. We like to say it's 2 clicks of a button and 2 seconds later, you have a completely compliant set of labels for your surgical case. The solution is as simple as that. And, there's a phrase here on the slide, there's elegance and simplicity. And that's one of the things that Peter is really focused on in developing the solution, is building it in a way that augments that anesthesia provider's workflow. The second component is that we strictly adhere to USP 797. So we're meeting those regulations. Peter's actually taken it multiple steps further in the sense that he follows ISMP guidelines. He follows exactly what CMS is saying. So we continue to monitor those regulations and continue to ensure that our software is completely compliant. And I'll just share this anecdote with you. We shared some emails with Joint Commission asking, would you view these labels as being compliant? And while certainly Joint Commission couldn't go on the record just due to the nature of their relationship with the marketplace, but we did receive positive messages back from one of the vice presidents indicating that our labels are completely compliant. So that's a very important aspect. And then the last piece. So I talked about that they want a system that's easy to implement and that's done at a fair price. But we've actually gone one step further in that regard. So we think our system is incredibly simple to deploy It reduces the burden for the support staff. We certainly think that we have priced the solution fairly and competitively in the marketplace. But where we took it a step further is we've added components to the software, to the label, that actually help the hospital system increase charge capture. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that, but that's an important aspect. In fact, I'll tell you, one of our clients that deployed this told us that the system helps pay for itself. So that's a very, very critical factor. Kevin, next slide. So finally here, you're going to get a visual of what it looks like. And I want to point out just the actual size of the solution. So what you see on the screen right now is the printer, the barcode scanner, and these are roughly the size of an iPad mini. And so hopefully maybe later on, Kevin, we'll have the opportunity to show the YouTube video. And this is another tool in your arsenal in terms of sharing with your customers that the product's easy to use, the product's easy to implement, and in fact, it doesn't take up a great deal of space, detracting from the anesthesia provider's workflow. So there's 3 components to what we offer customers. The focus is on our software. So that's what Peter has developed that sits on the printer that accomplishes the tasks of labeling. We have developed patent-pending labels. We actually hope to hear positive news regarding our patent on the labels in the next couple of months. But this is a key aspect to our product from a differentiation perspective with the competition. And then we have a whole set of services. So we want to help the customers not just take care of the hardware, but take care of the software. Because our objective, and I think your objective, is that this system is deployed for 5-7 years. And it's churning out labels, which represents an annuity revenue stream for your organization and for you. But that we want to make sure that the software is supporting their needs across that span of time. So next slide. So let's dig into the labels real quick. The one thing I would like everyone to walk away with is the fact that what you see on the screen is 100% customizable. So we don't have a standard, shall we say. Their drugs are completely customizable. The color palette that you see is completely customizable. And in fact, you can create multiple examples. So let me give some detail around what I mean by that. A vast majority of our clients want to create different label types. For example, what you see on the screen here may be considered a general anesthesia case, right? A typical knee, maybe a shoulder, Peter, maybe just something that's a fairly typical standard surgery. But there's certainly other types of cases that happen in a hospital. Pediatric is a great example. So certainly I think the drug doses are what primarily change in terms of pediatric. Obstetrics, right? So there's certain drugs that are leveraged in a OB case. Potentially cardiac, neurology, maybe transplant. Endoscopy as another example. So a vast majority of our clients actually will deploy the software with between 5 and 7 label designs, something we refer to as templates. And so what you'll see here is general anesthesia, but if the printer produced the obstetric label, you would actually get a whole different set of drugs as outlined by that particular hospital. So I think that's a key figure to be able to talk to the client about, because we do get a lot of questions when we show this particular image. Oh, well, gee, we don't use that drug, or we do things a little differently. Absolutely. Our software is capable of working with the way you want to do your labeling. So let's make sure we understand that, and if there's questions about that, we can absolutely answer those as we get to the end. Next slide. So here we wanted to show, a couple of key pieces. So first, the actual label on the syringe. And this is how we address compliance, right? So we're adding all of the data elements that are required by Joint Commission or AAAHC. This label has the drug, the dosage, the user initials, the date, the time, and then it's a little difficult to see, but just on the bottom of the yellow label is the beyond use date information as well. But here I'd like to point out the barcode. And so you'll see the information, Epic integration. So here I want to take just a couple of minutes to really dig into that charge capture piece. So what we have done working with a client here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that uses Epic is a cross-functional team came together with representatives from the client, from Vigilant Labels, as well as from Epic. And we built this barcode to incorporate data elements that streamline the documentation process. So let me give you an example of what the workflow was before they used this label. So before, they would have their case open, right? They would have the patient information on the screen in the OR, and they would administer a drug. And they would need to document the administration of that particular drug. That would require roughly 5 steps to do that within the Epic application. So the user would be touching the screen, navigating different menus, selecting items, moving to the next screen, all before they finish the process and sign that they had given that drug. And so what the client found was they were only documenting in the Epic record roughly 7 out of 10 medications. So there were situations, whether it was in the surgical case, there were issues, whether the anesthesia provider potentially was lazy or just forgot. They were losing roughly 3 medications out of 10 from a documentation perspective. And what's important is this client charges based on documentation. So what our workflow, what we did by implementing the barcode, is now once the anesthesia provider has administered the medication, they simply scan that barcode. They actually wave the syringe underneath the barcode scanner. And the application, the Epic application, recognizes that data element and shortcuts the 5 steps really down to a single step. And now the anesthesia provider will document, they'll sign that they've given that medication, and it's done. And so what the client saw was they saw about a 15% increase in their assessments in charge capture. So 15% more medications were being documented correctly as a result of the barcode implementation. And that's where the client came back and said, this is interesting because we think this actually pays for the system fairly rapidly. So we're doing some things right now to assess that ROI and be able to give you tools as you engage with clients to really understand what would the ROI be of an SSM, right, in St. Louis, or what would the ROI be of a Kaiser Permanente in Southern California. We think that would be a critical selling element as you build the case for a Vigilant solution. So here I want to really spend just a couple of minutes on the sales process and just give some recommendations of what we feel has worked best for us in engaging clients. So there's a few key questions, and let me pause and just say we plan on following up with not just the presentation, but a number of different materials, as well as these key questions. We'll send this to you, Kevin, and then if you'd like to distribute this out to the team. But I just want to be cognizant of people that may be traveling, may be on the road listening to this. We'll make these questions available to you after the fact. But there's 4 key questions that we talked about in preparation for this that are common themes with the customers. So the first thing that we like to ask them is whether they've considered an anesthesia labeling solution up to that point. right? The fact is, if we look at the landscape, about 80% of clients, we estimate, are still using label tape rolls. And they've been using those for 20 years. And so many of them may have not considered or just on the precipice of considering an anesthesia labeling solution. Just for your information, we think about 10% of the market has built a homegrown system. So they may be using Microsoft Word and a Staples label package, right, to create labels. And then we think 10% of the market has actually implemented our competitors in the space. So that's the first question, whether they've considered a labeling solution to date. And then from there, right, we can direct them a number of different ways in the conversation. Another question that we like to ask, just to be upfront with the customer, particularly if we're in front of them, is whether they're using label tape rolls, right? Some of you may actually have access to the OR. Some of you may have access to that environment. You might take a look and see what might they be using to label their syringes. We would venture a guess it's going to be the label tape rolls. And that's an opportunity, a huge opportunity. So the next question is really around compliance. And this one can get a little interesting, to be quite frank with everyone on the phone. So we like to, we'll ask oftentimes, is compliance with labeling an issue? And you get a variety of answers, right? So it can be an issue. Some hospitals like to say, oh, no, we're great. We label all the time, right? And you really sometimes have to dig into that and really understand, are they truly labeling as it relates to Joint Commission and the standard that has been set? And then the last, I think, piece, particularly for your Epic Cerner customers, is whether they would like to automate that documentation process, right? So if they do want to automate it, we are ready. We have a solution for them. We can plug right into their Epic application and help them with that automation. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the implementation, because I do want to leave the perception with everyone on the phone that it's incredibly easy to implement. It really can take just a few weeks from start to finish. And one of the things you might hear about the competition is it can take several months for them to truly implement a similar solution to what we offer. So there's 3 steps that we go through. So the first step to implementation is we simply need a user list, right? So send me a roster of all your anesthesiologists. The second is that we want to build those templates. So remember the conversation back where I talked about obstetrics, pediatric, cardiac, general surgery. We want to work with the customer to identify the templates that they want to build so that we can code the software. And that's typically what takes the most time, right? So that can take a couple of weeks. It could take a couple of conference calls to really walk through that. And then the last thing I'll point out is if they have changes, if they have additions, all stuff that we handle on an ongoing basis as they use our solution. Kevin, next slide. So here's a quick view of what our template designer looks like. So this would be the second phase that I referenced, where we want them to actually build their set of drugs for the different templates that they want. So Kevin, will you go to the next slide real quick? So here it is filled out, right? So the client has had a conference call with us. Oftentimes Peter will take that call. We have a couple of other resources like CRNAs that are capable of taking those calls as well. And we will talk them through the process to develop this template. And let me be clear, sometimes this requires them to have internal discussions offline, independent of us, to figure out, all right, which drugs are we going to standardize on? Are we going to use fentanyl at 50 mics? What kind of drugs do we want to see on our cardiac case, et cetera, et cetera. So oftentimes it does take collaboration amongst their internal anesthesia and pharmacy team to come up with this list of drugs and the templates that they want to use. But again, it's a very simple process. It's designed to be done in just a couple of weeks. Kevin, next slide. So here, and we're about to jump into the questions. So I just want to walk you through a couple of sales tools, materials that we will make available to help you. The first is we have a brochure. You know, I know Kevin has created a sales sheet that he likely has made available. If you're attending a trade show, we can supply trade show banners that talk about the Vigilant solution. The piece on the right I really want to highlight, and that's our sample label package. You know, this is something that can be used to help prospect. So it's a very nice, simple, mailable label package with a couple of our labels inside and some basic marketing messaging on the outside. And so it lets that client really place their hands on the label and start to understand, all right, we can use this. We can see how this is helpful. And then you can start to walk them through those benefits that I've already articulated. So we're going to make these sample label packages available. In fact, I've already mailed some out to Tom up in New York, and we'd be happy to continue to do that and support Kevin in providing those. Next slide. There's a couple of other pieces of material depending on what your client is asking. The piece on the left is a medical journal review article that specifically talks about the issues with labeling in the OR for anesthesia. This was published in AORN in January of 2018. And so we can make this available in PDF format. Again, it's another authoritative piece that talks about how syringe labeling is a challenge, and there's certainly a number of issues from a safety perspective behind labeling. Next slide. And so, Kevin, you know, with that, I hope that we've accomplished the three goals that were outlined at the very beginning. I hope we've accomplished what you wanted from this. But we're certainly available in the room. I have Peter. I also have Tom Browning with us. Tom is our CEO. We're happy to answer as many questions that come our way for the next 20, 25 minutes. And then certainly we're available with any questions, any opportunities that your team has in supporting those.
Well, I would like to hear from Dr. Beck, if that's okay. Have him just give us a few thoughts.
Sure, Kevin. Again, thanks to everybody for your time and energy. But you know, what's exciting for me as an anesthesiologist is the fact that I see my own colleagues who are, let's say, hesitant to label, who actually will use the system without any type of goading. I mean, the reality is that it's very challenging to change people's workflow and what they're used to. And especially physicians, the thinking is, I've done it this way for so long, why are you making me change my pattern or my behavior? And the reality is as Jeff mentioned, it's all about patient safety, so you can always argue patient safety, and you should never get any pushback from the anesthesiologist. But to the hospital's perspective, for them, it's all about the compliance issue, because the reality is that the anesthesia providers aren't being compliant, then they can really, literally, the CMS and other regulatory agencies can actually shut down the hospital and stop all funding. So it's in their best interest to be able to be compliant with all the labeling rules and things. But again, what's really nice about the system is that it's simple enough and it's designed for really the end user's benefit. Because if I am providing anesthesia, the reality is I really don't care about labels, and that's being honest. Okay, what I care about is taking care of the patient. If you end up frustrating the provider by forcing me to write all this labeling information, all it does is it makes me more angry rather than making me more conscientious and taking better care of the patient. if the hospital were to provide me this tool, this simple, easy-to-use system, which then allows me to be compliant, follow all the rules, and it actually makes my time more efficient and faster, then it's a win-win for everybody. So, and I think that, and I could tell you that every hospital, every anesthesiologist that actually use the system, that's a perspective that they all share as well.
Dr. Beck, can you see the device in the display in front of you? I mean, is it showing?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to do a quick little demo. Basically, the sheet I have in front of me is a bunch of barcodes, and basically this would be the hospital listing, and the physician would have these on their badge in the OR, and they would basically pull out their badge, and they would click twice onto their badge, and then the printer will basically print out the labels they need. Is that fast? So now I have the labels that I need for propofol, rocuronium, etc., and then they have the physician's initials, the time, and the date, and the by use information on it. So it literally is that fast and that easy. So a little bit of time is spent to make sure we get the drugs in the right color, and etc., and the right dosage. But after that is done, it literally is 2 button clicks, and they get their label. And now they put the labels on the syringes as they draw it up. And as I understand, basically, the biggest competition is not other necessarily labeling systems, but I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about Onyx, which is an alternative labeling system, but it is prefilled syringes. So what hospitals are going to now is they're going to prefilled syringes, and that increases their cost, and it increases their waste. So Dr. Beck, could you talk a little bit about the prefilled syringe phenomena and how we solve that or provide a cost-effective solution to it?
Sure. So,
and by the way, I cannot see you. If you can be on the screen, that would be easier. I don't know what happened. We lost visual, but that's okay. Please speak about prefilled syringes.
Sure. So prefilled syringes are a relatively new phenomena that came out about maybe 7 or 8 years ago. Started with Pharmedium as a third-party company that would make syringes that have come prefilled with the medication. Thereby, you don't need the little vials and the syringe, and then the sterile syringes, the blank syringes. The problem with prefilled syringes from a hospital and a pharmacy perspective is that they have a much shorter shelf life, okay? And then also, if you take a look at your drawers that you're selling, Kevin, you know that you need to physically have much more space to store prefilled syringes, because the end of the syringe, the plunger, has to be extended all the way out because of the medication. So if you had a 5 ml or a 10 ml syringe that normally fit in an area that was only maybe 3 or 4 inches, now because it becomes pre-filled, now you need that double the length, okay? So then that becomes another issue for pharmacy in terms of stocking. They need more frequent restocking of the carts, and then the expiration information or expiration of the prefilled syringes typically is about 60 to 90 days from the time that it comes to the hospital, versus the vials can sometimes be 2 or 3 years. So the argument for prefilled syringes, though, really have to go towards pharmacy and maybe the anesthesia techs. And to be quite frank, as an anesthesiologist, even though I'm the founder of the company, I would prefer prefilled syringes because it is one less step that I need to do. But a hospital can eat through all of its budget just if they were to try to go with prefilled syringes. And most hospitals will go with maybe 2 or 3, but there's no way that they can replace all of the anesthesia drugs that we currently use in the hospital with all prefilled syringes. So one way that, so at the hospital that we referenced in Texas, one other way that they help pay for the system is they were wasting about $10,000 to $15,000 a month on pre-filled ephedrine. simply because with ephedrine, it's an emergency drug, and you never want to run a shortage of it because if you need it. So what ended up happening is they actually purchased in excess, and then 60 to 90 days from now, they have to throw all that stock away because they can't use it anymore. By going back to the vials and using our labels, they were able to save about $10,000 a month just by reducing or going back to that just on one.
We may have lost Dr. Beck. Can everybody still hear Dr. Beck?
Hello?
Now I can hear you.
Okay.
Hey, Dr. Beck, can you make a comment on the FDA problems that Pharmedium is having? And then also, is there any VA pricing?
So FDA recently came out, and this was probably about 8 or 9 months ago. And let me kind of I'll mention that as another thing as well. The FDA came out with a recall for about a majority of all the products that Pharmedium made at one of their plants. So across the country, every hospital that purchased those prefilled syringes and medications from Pharmedium, they had to get rid of those. And then they had to scramble back to find other sources. That email or that notice from the FDA came out in January. But the other thing that's really important to note as well is that the FDA never stated that these syringes were to be used as long-term storage containers, which in effect, when you use prefilled syringes, that's what they become. So about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago now, there's a regulatory body agent called ISMP. What they did is they actually sent out a national notice because the makers of the syringe changed the formulation of the silicone in the black rubber gasket. As a result, every single medication that had been pre-filled with that syringe actually had a 30 to 50% reduction in the efficacy of that medication. So, you know, if people think that you're going to get what you get with the pre-filled syringes and the quality is just as good as the vials, I'm afraid that they're sorely mistaken about that.
Well, it sounds like they also run the risk of being committed to Pharmedium, and if Pharmedium has a back order on a drug, they're going to have a back order on a drug.
That's absolutely correct. That's a very good point, Kevin.
Okay. Let me think. So one of the things I want to make sure reps understand is what they're doing right now, or what they used to do in the past. You can have some drugs filled under a hood in the pharmacy, and they have a longer shelf life. But drugs that are filled actually drawn up from a bigger vial in the OR have a less of a shelf life. So, Dr. Beck, can you comment on that kind of environment?
Sure. What you're referring to, Kevin, is what Jeff had mentioned earlier, which is the USP 797 regulation. And the USP 797 are the rules by which the U.S. Pharmacopoeia states on the safe transfer of sterile medications. So if you were to transfer medication from a sterile container to a syringe, for example, another sterile container, in one of the pharmacy hoods that have laminar airflow, and they're wearing gloves and they're wearing masks and all. In that type of scenario, the expiration of that medicine is typically about 6 hours from the time that it's drawn up. In any other environment outside of that, so in other words, if you did it outside, the air quality actually, and this is a funny rule, if you did it outside, like in the park or outside in an airport or someplace, it has the same rules of me drawing it up in the operating room, and that's the 1 hour rule. Okay, so if you start drawing up a medication in the operating room or in the airport, wherever, you have to start using it within 1 hour of drawing it up. And again, that's why it's so important that the documentation of when it was drawn up is on every single label. Because if you don't have that documentation as to when it was drawn up, you don't know when that 1 hour expires. Now, the other thing that your reps need to know as well is that has to do with only when you start using the medication, okay? Because what ends up happening is a narcotic like fentanyl, for example, it often comes in 5 ml vial. You use 1 or 2 mLs every hour. So you still, within your syringe, will have maybe 3 or 4 mLs left. As long as you start using it within the hour, USP 797 has no rules whatsoever concerning how quickly or the expiration of that medication once you start using it. So the basic guideline associated with what ISMP suggests is as long as you can continue using it just for the duration of the case, you're absolutely fine. Okay? So just to summarize, if you draw it up, you have 60 minutes to start using it. Okay? On minute 61, if you haven't started using it, you got to throw it away. But if you used it on minute 59, you could use it for the duration of the case. And again, that's assuming that we follow the strict guidelines and the letter of the law of USP 797.
And the whole issue of labeling syringes is to keep track of what drugs they have drawn up. Tom in New York has sent me a picture that I'll send out to everyone that has a physician that just threw down a bunch of syringes, and you really can't see what's going on, and it's almost appalling. But the whole idea is they've got to keep track of what they're doing. And I don't know, can anybody see this picture?
Yes, I can see it. Yes.
Okay, Tom, John Greco, if you're available to go off mute, can you talk a little bit about the experience you had in this hospital? He may be off again. Oh, I think he's on, but he's got to go off mute. But at any rate, he told me that the physician came in, dropped a few syringes on the floor, picked them up, connected a few, and then threw all these syringes that are pre-drawn up onto the anesthesia work station, and then went out to talk to the patient. So part of labeling, the original labeling, was to keep track of your syringes. And now the Joint Commission and various people have come out with these rules that you got to time stamp them and date stamp them. And anesthesia doesn't really often believe that that really adds to any increased safety, because the issue is when you draw it up, how long ago did you draw it up? And they just don't necessarily believe that it's that big of a deal. But obviously labeling them correctly is the most basic thing. And then now making it easy for these physicians who don't even care about labeling to meet compliance is the key. Because right now what happens is pharmacy doesn't believe that anesthesia is disciplined enough to put their name, their initials, the date, and the time that they drew up these drugs. And as a result, they're nervous that they're going to get in trouble because anesthesia isn't following the mandates. As a result, that's why pharmacy is moving toward pre-filled syringes. I have one facility that I'm trying to get into here that is literally revising the entire way they're doing things in the OR because of drugs and drug labeling. I believe they're going with all pre-filled syringes, and as a result, they're having to get larger drug carts, and it's squeezing out the space for their anesthesia carts. So they're literally having to get rid of all their standard anesthesia carts and get tall, narrow ones and redesign where they put everything so that they can make more space for all these pre-filled syringes that they're bringing in. So there's a lot of accounts that are in this issue right now, so you want to make sure you ask these questions and show the Vigilant system. Dr. Beck, do you have any comments on that?
You're absolutely right, Kevin, because about the concept of pharmacy being the fear factor, right? That really needs to drive, they're driving this because of the fact that they know we cannot be trusted to do the right thing, and that's just a reality. The only way to make us do the right thing is you got to make it simple, okay? Because like I said earlier, we're focused on taking care of the patient. Labeling is kind of an afterthought. It's something that needs to be done because the man says I have to do it. But if it's not done correctly, the hospital can get shut down, and that's why hospitals and pharmacies are investing all that money to go to 4 to 5 times what they were spending before to go to a prefilled syringe solution, just to avoid that possibility of getting caught without labeling.
Jeff or Peter, could you make a comment? Let's say we made a call on pharmacy. What questions? Who would we ask for, and what questions would we ask pharmacy?
Well, certainly I think it's beneficial to start with the director of pharmacy. We find in our conversations that they're the ones that understand the issue. They have the view kind of above the fray, and they certainly want to offer a solution to the problem to not just their hospital leadership, but also the anesthesia team, to Peter's perspective, that is simple to use. From a question perspective, it's as straightforward as the ones that I talked about earlier. Asking the pharmacy director, are you concerned about labeling compliance in the OR? Have you looked at a solution previously? So you referenced Onyx, which is the logical competitor to us. There's a couple of other companies that are starting to touch syringe labeling, but Onyx is the most obvious. So it's possible that the pharmacy director has already had an engagement with Onyx, has already formed an opinion about the cost of their system, about the difficulty of implementation, about the workflow, because anesthesia providers may have told the pharmacy director that it's not an optimal workflow, maybe not as nice as I'm saying it. Peter says it a much different way, which makes us all laugh a little bit. But certainly I would just focus in on compliance, labeling use, and whether they've looked at a system to date, and then what maybe held them back from implementing a solution. Because we're doing things a little differently than what the competition has done. And that may solve some of the reasons that they held back in their previous discussions with other labeling solutions. Does that make sense?
One of the questions we would ask anesthesia is who in the pharmacy gets involved with the syringes and the drugs that they use. And they might be able to give, so if I'm talking to an anesthesia tech or the chief of anesthesia, I might be able to get a reference name or a name from them that is involved with pharmacy. And it may be the director of pharmacy. Sometimes I do believe, in fact in Barnes, there's a operating room pharmacist. So there's a kind of a director of the operating room with pharmacy as their main concern. So I think anesthesia is our first call, but we should ask who in the pharmacy is involved with drugs that are being used in the operating room.
Yeah, and I'll point out one other title, which is pharmacy informaticist, right? So someone that likely has been a pharmacist, but maybe has moved into an IT capacity. That individual may have specific experience with the medical record issues, with the workflow issues, and with technology for labeling. So that's another title that we've worked with in our engagements.
Dr. Beck, could you talk or comment about Onyx and how they work compared to us in just a brief?
Yeah, so to put it bluntly, they're crap. The problem with the Onyx system...
Now, they're crap from a user perspective. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes. Because the problem is it's designed not for the end user, but really over-designed to please the hospital pharmacy and other regulatory agencies. So they do a lot of things like so from a workflow perspective, again, you have to understand that labeling is a nuisance to me. So whatever I can do to minimize the nuisance is something that I would like to use as compared so that I could focus on the patient. So the workflow with Onyx requires the anesthesiologist to pick up every single vial individually, scan the vial, and wait 10 or 15 seconds for a single label to print. So the average anesthesia surgery, the average surgery requires 10 to 12 drugs. So you're going to waste 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes of your time just scanning and waiting for labels to print with their system. Versus with my system, with the Vigilant Label system, in 2 seconds you're going to get that whole sheet of labels. So again, you're just very systematically drawing up the labels just like you're used to doing, but getting all the compliance issues solved. So from an end user perspective, I would rather spend 2 seconds and get labels as compared to wasting 1.5 minutes just waiting for labels with the competitor.
Okay. Do you have any other things you want to cover? We're almost at an hour, and that's when we usually like to cut it off. I'm confident I'll be able to send out a lot of information to everybody that's provided to me by Jeff and Peter. Jeff and Peter, do you want to have any final thoughts?
No, we'll just summarize by thanking everyone for joining. We're here to support your sales efforts. So whatever it is that you need as you engage with clients, reach out to Peter, reach out to myself, and we'll work with you as best we can. So again, thanks for the time.
Hey, Kevin, John Patterson, one quick question. They mentioned integration with Epic and Cerner. Are there any other EMRs that you're integrated with?
So not today. We are actively working on integration with Cerner, so I don't want you to walk away thinking it's complete. We're certainly targeting Meditech as well as some of the anesthesia information systems like iProcedures or Plexus. So we're working on those integrations as well. It's an ongoing process for us.
But John, be aware that the manual system of just printing the labels with all the data on it definitely meets the compliance information. It's just that they're working on making it all automatic as it is with the Epic system where they can scan it into that system. So it's still viable to just be using as a manual labeling system, if you will.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
The other thing I would like to just say is this is a significant opportunity. We have one of our reps in New York did a quote just recently for almost $88,000. If you have a 30 OR hospital, they're going to need 30 of these things. If you have a 50 OR hospital, they're going to need 50 or more. Wherever they have an anesthesia location, such as labor and delivery, GI, they're going to need one of our systems. And we make, they'll pay about 50 cents per label. We make a little money on the labels. We make a little money on the service. And obviously we make some money when we actually sell the system. We're willing to consider rentals and pay-as-you-go ownership. So we'll consider all different options. But the opportunity is significant, and it's a critical issue for your customers right now. So get out there and talk to your anesthesia departments. Get on the phone, do a dialing for dollars, and call your top 10 hospitals. I would not start with the small hospitals. I would start with your biggest hospitals and call them and ask your anesthesia tech contact, your anesthesiologist contact, are they making any decisions with regards to drug labeling, and who is the contact in pharmacy? And then call them and ask those questions, because you do not want to be behind in this. You want to be ahead, and then you'll be a viable alternative farm. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jeff. I'm confident we're going to get more information from you, and as we do, I'll forward that on to the sales reps. But thank you, everyone, for taking the time to learn about Vigilant Labeling and the opportunity that Bell Medical has with this fine company. Thanks, everyone.